Getting back to that tight Senate race again in the state of Indiana, the one that has been up in the air all evening, now with 24% of the vote in. Ruckelshaus has 51% of the vote. By with 49%. By coming up rather dramatically in these last few moments. And I recall, Sandy, that 6 years ago, By's strength didn't show until rather late. Apparently, Lake County returns are late in coming in. David?
Let's look at the popular vote total. The popular vote total. And it shows, again, that Humphrey is closing in on Nixon. There are now 3 percentage points separating them. Earlier in the evening, there were 8. They're about, I won't try to do any subtraction on the air because a mistake would be too public, but as you see, it is something like 300,000 votes separating them out of about 6 million. 38% for Humphrey, 41% for Nixon, 21% for Wallace. Now the electoral votes, those based on NBC's projections of states already won, show Nixon the projected winner in 8 states, having 77 electoral votes, Humphrey in 5 with 53, Wallace in 2 with 17. 36 states remain undecided. As you see, Nixon has 77, but that's still a great distance from having the 270 he needs to win. To Ed Newman. Ed?
In the House, of the 435 contests, 222 have now been decided. That's more than half, if my arithmetic is correct. And not a single seat has changed hands. The Democrats have won 128, the Republicans 96. And we have to say again that all of these were safe seats, or relatively safe seats, and they have gone as it was forecast that they would. Now, of course, it matters who gets the greater number of members in the House, the Republicans or the Democrats, because the party that does organizes and controls the House, elects the Speaker, names the committee chairman, and so on. But there's something else to think about in the House races, especially in this very close election, and that is that if the presidential race goes into the House, the new president will be named there. And that depends on who controls the majority of state delegations. So we're bringing up a new board who controls these particular state delegations. At the moment, the Democrats control 5, the Republicans 1. Democratic states so far: Georgia, Mississippi, Missouri, Texas, West Virginia, the Republican Ohio. These are very early times. I don't want to attempt to draw any conclusions about this. The race may not go into the House. If it does, nobody can say what will happen. But if it does go into the House, it's extremely important who controls the majority of state delegations, because each delegation, no matter what the state size, gets 1 vote. So we'll be watching that very closely also. Now to Sander Vanocur.
We have 2 projected winners, 2 new projected winners in the senatorial contest. The first is in the state of Maryland, where NBC News projects the winner, Republican Congressman Charles McMathias from suburban Maryland County, that's right around Washington, as the projected winner over the incumbent Senator Daniel Brewster. Brewster was a very strong supporter of President Johnson's on Vietnam. In the contest, you may remember that name. If we can hold that a minute, we're projecting Mathias. Can we go back? That man Mahoney, George Mahoney, ran for the governorship of Maryland in 1966 as a Democrat, and he was beaten by none other than Spiro Agnew. And Mahoney ran on what a lot of people consider was a racist platform, whose appeal was based on the slogan, "Your home is your castle, protect it." That was in opposition to the open housing, and Spiro Agnew beat him. The other projected winner we have, the new projected winner, is in the state of New Hampshire, where the incumbent, Norris Cotton, we project is the winner over Governor John King, the Democrat. There is an incumbent who may be in trouble in the state of Pennsylvania, and that is Joseph Clark, the Democratic senator in the state of Pennsylvania. If we can move to the Pennsylvania board, we'll look at the situation over there. There we are. Joseph Clark, seeking his 3rd term in the Senate, trails Congressman Richard Schweiker from suburban Philadelphia by a goodly margin at this time. Now, we don't know whether Philadelphia is in yet, but Clark is running behind, and Clark was an early opponent of the Vietnam War, later supported President Johnson, but he is now trailing Republican Congressman Richard Schweiker. In the state of Oklahoma, there appears to be a very close race, but the incumbent, Mike Monroney, seeking his 4th term, is trailing the former governor, Henry Bellman, the first Republican ever to be elected governor of the state of Oklahoma, by about 9 points. Bellman, as you may remember, was the first man to head the Nixon for President committee, then dropped out to run his senatorial contest, and he now leads Mike Mulroney, who is seeking his 4th term in the Senate in Oklahoma. In Indiana, as you mentioned a few moments ago, Chet, Birch Bayh, the incumbent seeking his 2nd term, is closing the gap, but he still trails William Ruckelshaus, a young man, 35. Bayh is a young man, too. He's 40, in that contest in the state of Indiana. In the state of Missouri, the lieutenant governor, Thomas Eagleton, who defeated the incumbent, Edward Long, in the Democratic primary. Eagleton was a McCarthy supporter, favored a ceasefire in Vietnam. He's very liberal. He is now leading Representative Tom Curtis, a very able member of the House of Representatives, Republican, on the House Ways and Means Committee. Curtis is considered the hardest working member of the House of Representatives, and he is now trailing Eagleton. In Ohio, that race, Gilligan, the former Democratic congressman, trails the Attorney General, William Saxby, in that state to take the seat which Frank Lausch used to hold before he was defeated in the primary by Gilligan. Now, Chet.
Sandy, on the basis of projections, then, again by rapid calculation, you show a net Republican gain of 2 now?
2 seats, yes.
2 seats.
Florida, where the issue was law and order, Gurney hit it very hard. And they have picked up a seat in Maryland, because that's a little harder to figure out, because Brewster, as I say, took a very tough position on the war in Vietnam. Mathias was a backer of Rockefeller, and he does very well in the Republican areas around Washington, the suburban areas. It was thought he might be hurt by a heavy Wallace vote in eastern Maryland, but apparently he hasn't been. So that is a net gain of 2, Maryland and Florida.
Very good. We'll be back in just a moment.
Now let's look at North Carolina. In North Carolina, Humphrey is doing poorly. He's 3rd. Nixon is ahead with 36%. Wallace is 2nd, 33%. And Humphrey 3rd with 30%. In South Carolina, Wallace is ahead there. Nixon is 2nd. And Humphrey is 3rd. That, again, is Senator Strom Thurmond's state, and he was most anxious to deliver it to Nixon. He may yet, we don't know, but that's where it stands at the moment. In Ohio, one of the big industrial states, Nixon is leading at the moment. 16% of the vote has been counted and put on our boards, and Nixon is leading with 48%. Humphrey is 2nd with 40%, and Wallace has 12%. In Missouri, 13% of it is counted. Humphrey here at this early stage has a fairly substantial lead, 52% of the vote. Nixon 2nd with 38%. Wallace 3rd with 10%. Now to John Chancellor and his marvelous machine. John?
We will note that, Richard, that Humphrey won the District of Columbia, which of course is an overwhelmingly Negro city. And the Negroes are going for Hubert Humphrey, but it's very interesting to note that where Humphrey needs the Negro votes, they are, many of them, staying home. In the industrial Midwest, which are the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, our calculations indicate now that something like between 10 and 15% of the Negroes who voted the last time are not voting this time. And this is very interesting because in the southern states of the United States, where there has been a great effort to register Negro voters over the past 4 years, registration was up 14% this year. And so where more Negroes are voting in the South, fewer Negroes are voting in the industrial Midwest. We have a very high Negro defection rate indicated in Kentucky in some of the early returns. We have a fairly high defection rate in Indiana, which Richard Nixon has been projected as a winner. So that the irony of this for Hubert Humphrey is that while overall in the country there are a few more percentage points of Negroes registered this time than 4 years ago, they are not where he needs them. Now here's Frank McGee.
Thank you, John. NBC News has projected another winner in the governor's race, this one in Missouri. And it is our projection that the Democratic incumbent, Warren Hearns, will gain re-election. With 13% of the vote in, he's running at 63% over Republican Lawrence Roos. And we say that when the figures are finally tallied, Hearns' percentage will be 60%. Hearns is getting 3 out of 4 votes in St. Louis. There's a large Negro registration in St. Louis, about 35%. Hearns has been popular enough with them. He lost some popularity, however, when he called up the National Guard to quell a riot last spring. Now we have a race in Indiana. Although more than 25% of the vote has been tallied there, and there's a wide separation in the percentage points, we think this race for governor in Indiana between Republican Whitcomb and Democrat Rock is still too close to call. And in Kansas, we have an exceptionally close race with 6% of the vote in. Docking, the Democratic incumbent, 50%. Harmon, the Republican challenger, 50%. So there we are. So far, of the 4 races in which NBC News has made projections, 2 have gone to Democrats, but Democrats held those state houses already, so there's no net gain for them there. 2 of the races we have projected will go to Republicans. They held neither of them, so as of the moment, the Republicans have scored a net gain of 2 state houses. Chet?
Here are returns from several more states. Maryland. 18% of the vote is now counted. Nixon's leading with 49%. Humphrey with 33%. Wallace with a significant 18%. Massachusetts, 6% of the vote is in, but it is NBC's projection that Humphrey will carry Massachusetts with 61% of the vote. Delaware. First returns are in from Delaware. They are fragmentary, meaning very little, if anything. 1%, less than 1% of the vote. Nixon with 60%. Georgia, 11% of the vote is now in, and Wallace is leading with 48% of the vote. Humphrey second with 28%. Nixon third with 24%. I wonder if we might take a look at the popular vote board for just a moment. 11% of the national vote is now in. This board changes, by the way, about every 60 seconds. Nixon is still leading with 41%, but Humphrey has just closed another percentage point and is now trailing by 2 points with 39%. Wallace holding steady at 20%. Perhaps that is significant. Humphrey, to repeat, just closed 1 more percentage point. Earlier in the evening, you recall, he was 8 percentage points behind. And we'll be back in just a moment.
In Arkansas, NBC News projects the winner in the race for Senate to be the incumbent Senator Fulbright, the Democrat. He is our projected winner for re-election to the Senate from Arkansas. A few minutes ago at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel here in New York, which is Nixon's campaign headquarters here. That's where their celebration will be if they have one. Herbert Kaplow of NBC News interviewed just a few minutes ago Robert Finch, who is Nixon's campaign manager. And we're going to switch to that now, to Herbert Kaplow talking to Nixon's campaign manager, Robert Finch, on tape made a few minutes ago.
We are with Robert Finch, who is the Lieutenant Governor of California and also has been for many years a close associate of Richard Nixon. He was with Mr. Nixon in 1960 and is with him now. Mr. Finch, you have been studying the returns as they come in this evening. What's your observation on the basis of them?
Herb, I flatly predict victory. We picked up insurance states where we were not sure, like Tennessee, Kentucky, and Florida. I think we'll carry Texas. It looks good in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Ohio. So I think we're going to win.
Can you tell us basically what your campaign strategy was?
Well, it was to zero in on these critical electoral college states. That was the purpose of the telethons, and I think in 1960 we spread ourselves pretty thin. And I think that strategy has paid off. I think we're going to have to look at the Electoral College and decide whether we're going to allow that to continue to be the mechanism by which we select our presidents. But we had to face that reality.
On the basis of what you've seen so far, how do you think Texas is going to go?
I think we'll win it.
Now, there are 8 states that you consider the big ones, up through number 8, New Jersey. And I think in the planning until today, you figured you were behind in New York and Michigan.
Well, we figured those were close.
And what about the others?
Well, we're very much encouraged because the other, the border states we've gotten, and I think we'll carry California, so that I'm very optimistic. I think the only ones in question are Michigan at this point and perhaps New York, right?
How do you explain the strange behavior of the polls in the last week?
I don't know. I think we're going to have an accounting after this is over. I think these pollsters have hedged to the point where they've almost destroyed their credibility.
Thank you very much. We have been talking with Robert Finch, the Lieutenant Governor of California, who was a close associate of Richard Nixon. Herbert Kaplow, NBC News at Nixon headquarters in New York.
Again, the latest word from the NBC News projection team is that the race for the presidency still is very close. The key states at this hour seem to be New York, Illinois, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. If Humphrey carries these states and other big states, it might be enough to offset the victories by Nixon in the other states and the ones which he has carried thus far and which he hopes to carry. We'll be back in just a moment. Let's go to the board showing the popular vote. 12% of the national vote is now in. Nixon is now leading with 42% and Humphrey with 38%. In other words, Nixon has jumped back into a 4% national lead at this moment. Wallace continues to hold very steadily at 20% of the popular vote. The other candidates, several of them, are trailing far behind with yet to register 1% of the total vote. Now let's go to the Electoral College Board and see how that adds up to this moment. Nixon has carried 8 states for a total of 77 votes in the Electoral College. Hubert Humphrey has carried 5 states, including the District of Columbia, for a total of 53. George Wallace still stands with 2 states to his credit for a total of 17 electoral votes. 36 states yet undecided, representing a total of 391 big electoral votes. Again, let's recap the popular vote board. There was a change up there while we were talking. 13% of the vote is now in. Nixon with 41%. Humphrey with 38%. 3 percentage points back. Wallace, again, still holding at 20%.